Preface. 1. Dangerous books. Somebody remarked, "I can tell by my own reaction to it that this book is harmful." But let him only wait, and perhaps one day he will admit to himself that this same book has done him a great service by bringing out the hidden sickness of his heart and making it visible. Altered opinions do not alter a man's character, or do so very little. But they do illuminate individual aspects of the constellation of his personality, which, with a different constellation of opinions, had hitherto remained dark and unrecognizable. 2. Against the censurers of brevity. Something said briefly can be the fruit of much long thought, but the reader who is a novice in this field, and has as yet reflected on it not at all, sees in everything said briefly something embryonic, not without censuring the author for having served him up such immature and unripened fare. 3. The worst readers. The worst readers are those who behave like plundering troops. They take away a few things they can use, dirty and confound the remainder, and revile the whole. 4. Marks of the good reader. Good writers have two things in common. They prefer to be understood rather than admired, and they do not write for knowing and over-acute readers. 5. Of all that is written, I love only that which is written with blood. Write with blood, and you will discover that blood is spirit. It is not easy to understand the blood of another. I hate the reading idler. He who knows the reader does nothing further for the reader. Another century of readers, and spirits itself will stink. That everyone is allowed to learn to read will, in the long run, ruin not only the writing, but thinking too. Once spirit was God, then it became man, and now it is becoming mob. He who writes in blood and aphorisms does not want to be read. He wants to be learned by heart. In the mountains the shortest route is from peak to peak, but for that you must have long legs. Aphorisms should be peaks, and those to whom they are addressed should be big and tall of stature. The air thin and pure, danger near, and the spirit full of a joyful wickedness. These things go well together. I want hobgoblins around me, for I am courageous. Courage, which scares away phantoms, creates hobgoblins for itself. Courage wants to laugh. I no longer feel as you do. This cloud which I see under me, this blackness and heaviness I laugh at, precisely this is your thunder cloud. You look up when you desire to be exalted, and I look down because I am exalted. Who of you can at once laugh and be exalted? He who climbs upon the highest mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary. Courageous, untroubled, mocking, violent, that is what wisdom wants us to be. Wisdom is a woman, and loves only a warrior. 6. It is not for nothing that one has been a philologist. Perhaps one is a philologist still, that is to say, a teacher of slow reading. In the end, one also writes slowly. Nowadays it is not only my habit, but it is also to my taste, a malicious taste perhaps, no longer to write anything which does not reduce to despair every sort of man who is in a hurry. For philology is that venerable art which demands of its votaries one thing above all, to go aside, to take time, to become still, to become slow. It is a goldsmith's art and connoisseurship of the word which has nothing but delicate, cautious work to do, and achieves nothing if it does not achieve it lento. But for precisely this reason, it is more necessary than ever today. By precisely this means does it entice and enchant us the most. In the midst of an age of work, that is to say of hurry, of indecent and perspiring haste, which wants to get everything done at once, including every old or new book, this art does not so easily get anything done. It teaches to read well, that is to say, to read slowly, deeply, looking cautiously before and aft, with reservations, with doors left open, with delicate eyes and fingers. My patient friends, this book desires for itself only perfect readers and philologists. Learn to read me well. 7. On the question of intelligibility, one does not want only to be understood when one writes, but just as surely not to be understood. It is absolutely no objection to a book if anyone finds it unintelligible. Perhaps that was part of its author's intention. He did not want to be understood by anyone. When it wants to communicate itself, every nobler spirit and taste also selects its audience. In selecting them, it also debars the others. All the more subtle rules of style have their origin here. They hold at arm's length, they create distance, they forbid admission, understanding, while at the same time they alert the ears of those who are related to us through their ears. But between ourselves and with reference to my own case, I want neither my ignorance nor the ebullience of my temperament to hinder my being intelligible to you, my friends, however much my ebullience may compel me to get hold of a thing quickly if I am to get hold of it at all. For I regard profound problems as I do a cold bath, quick in, quick out. That one thereby fails to get down deep enough, fails to reach the depths, is the superstition of hydrophobics, of the enemies of cold water. They speak without experience. Oh, great cold makes one quick. And by the way, does a thing really remain unintelligible and unrecognized if it is touched, viewed, illumined simply in passing? Does one absolutely have to sit down on it first, to have brooded on it as on an egg? There are at the very least truths of a peculiar timidity and ticklishness which one can seize hold of only suddenly, which one must surprise or leave alone. My brevity has finally another value. Within such questions as engage my attention, I have to say many things briefly, so that they may be heard even more briefly. For as an immoralist one must guard against corrupting innocence. I mean the asses and old maids of both sexes who have got nothing from life except their innocence. More, my writings ought to inspire and uplift them and encourage them to virtue. So much as regards brevity, my ignorance, of which I make no secret even to myself, is a worse matter. There are times when I am ashamed of it. Also, to be sure, times when I am ashamed of being ashamed. Perhaps we philosophers are all of us ill-equipped when it comes to knowledge. Science is expanding. The most scholarly of us are on the point of discovering that they know too little. Still, it would be even worse if things were otherwise. If we knew too much, our task is and remains above all not to take ourselves for what we are not. We are something other than scholars, though the fact cannot be got around that, among other things, we are also scholarly. We have other requirements, another way of growing, another way of digesting. We need more, we also need less. For how much nourishment a spirit requires, there is no formula. But if its taste is for independence, for rapid coming and going, for wandering, perhaps for adventures to which only the swiftest are equal, then it prefers to live free on a light diet than unfree and stuffed. Not fat, but the greatest suppleness and strength is what a good dancer wants from his food, and I do not know what the spirit of a philosopher could more wish to be than a good dancer, for the dance is his ideal, also his art, finally also the only kind of piety he knows, his divine service. 8. If this writing is unintelligible to anyone and jars on his ears, the fault is, it seems to me, not necessarily mine. It is clear enough, assuming, as I do assume, that one has read my earlier writings and has not spared some effort in doing so, for they are not easily accessible. As regards my Zarathustra, for example, I count no one as being familiar with it who has not at some time been profoundly wounded and at some time profoundly enraptured by every word in it, for only then may he enjoy the privilege of reverentially participating in the halcyon element out of which that work was born, in its sunlit brightness, remoteness, breadth, and certainty. In other cases, the aphoristic form creates difficulty. It arises from the fact that today this form is not taken sufficiently seriously. An aphorism, properly stamped and molded, has not been deciphered when it has simply been read. One has then rather to begin its exegesis. for which is required an art of exegesis. To be sure, to practice reading as an art in this fashion, one thing above all is needed. Precisely the thing which has nowadays been more thoroughly unlearned, and that is why it will be some time before my writings are readable, a thing for which one must be almost a cow, and in any event not a modern man. Rumination. 9. I am often asked why I really write in German. Nowhere am I read worse than in the fatherland, but who knows, after all, whether I even wish to be read today. To create things upon which time tries to its teeth in vain, in form and in substance to strive for a little immortality, I have never been modest enough to demand less of myself. The aphorism, the apophthegm, are the forms of eternity. My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book. 10. The conditions under which one understands me and then necessarily understands, I know them all too well. One must be honest in intellectual matters to the point of harshness, to so much as endure my seriousness, my passion. One must be accustomed to learning on mountains, to seeing the wretched ephemeral chatter of politics and national egoism beneath one. One must have become indifferent. One must never ask whether truth is useful or whether it is a fatality, a preference born of strength for questions for which no one today has the courage. Courage for the forbidden, predestination for the labyrinth, an experience out of 7 solitudes, new ears for new music, new eyes for the most distant things, a new conscience for truths which have hitherto remained dumb, and the will to economy in the grand style, to keeping one's force, one's enthusiasm in bounds, reverence for oneself, love for oneself, unconditional freedom with respect to oneself. Very well. These alone are my readers, my rightful readers, my predestined readers. What do the rest matter? The rest are merely mankind. One must be superior to mankind in force, in loftiness of soul, in contempt. 11. I am one thing, my writings are another. Here, before I speak of these writings themselves, I shall touch on the question of their being understood or not being understood. I shall do so as perfunctorily as is fitting, for the time for this question has certainly not yet come. My time has not yet come. Some are born posthumously. One day or other, institutions will be needed in which people live and teach as I understand living and teaching. Perhaps even chairs for the interpretation of Zarathustra will then be established. But it would be a complete contradiction of myself if I expected ears and hands for my truths already today. That I am not heard today, that no one today knows how to take from me, is not only comprehensible, it even seems to me right. I do not want to be taken for what I am not, and that requires that I do not take myself for what I am not. It seems to me that to take a book of mine into his hands is one of the rarest distinctions anyone can confer on himself. I even assume he removes his shoes when he does so, not to speak of boots. When Dr. Heinrich von Stein once honestly complained that he understood not one word of my Zarathustra, I told him that it was quite in order to have understood, that is to say, experienced, 6 sentences of that book would raise one to a higher level of mortals than modern man could attain to. How could I, with this feeling of distance, not even want the modern men I know to read me? Not that I should like to underestimate the pleasure which the innocence in the rejection of my writings has given me. This very summer just gone, at a time when, with my own too heavily weighty literature, I was perhaps throwing all the rest of literature off its balance, a professor of Berlin University kindly gave me to understand that I ought really to avail myself of a different form. No one read stuff like mine. In the end, it was not Germany but Switzerland which authored the 2 extreme cases, an essay of Dr. V. Widman in the Bund on Beyond Good and Evil under the title Nietzsche's Dangerous Book, and a general report on my books as a whole on the part of Herr Karl Spittler, also in the Bund, constitute a maximum in my life of what I take care not to say. The latter, for example, dealt with my Zarathustra as an advanced exercise in style, with the request that I might later try to provide some content. Dr. Whitman expressed his respect for the courage with which I strive to abolish all decent feelings. Through a little trick of chance, every sentence here was, with a consistency I had to admire, a truth stood on its head. Remarkably enough, all one had to do was to revalue all values in order to hit the nail on the head with regard to me, instead of hitting my head with a nail. All the more reason for me to attempt an explanation. Ultimately, no one can extract from things, books included, more than he already knows. What one has no access to through experience, one has no ear for. Now let us imagine an extreme case, that a book speaks of nothing but events which lie outside the possibility of general or even of rare experience. That it is the first language for a new range of experiences. In this case, simply nothing will be heard, with the acoustical illusion that where nothing is heard, there is nothing. This is in fact my average experience, and if you like, the originality of my experience. Whoever believed he had understood something of me had dressed up something out of me after his own image, not uncommonly an antithesis of me, for instance an idealist. Whoever had understood nothing of me denied that I came into consideration at all. 12. I know my privileges as a writer to some extent. In individual cases, it has also been put to me how greatly habituation to my writings ruins taste. One can simply no longer endure other books, philosophical ones least of all. To enter this noble and delicate world is an incomparable distinction. To do so, one absolutely must not be a German. It is in the end a distinction one has to have earned. But he who is related to me through loftiness of will experiences when he reads me real ecstasies of learning. For I come from heights no bird has ever soared to. I know abysses into which no foot has ever yet strayed. I have been told it is impossible to put a book of mine down. I even disturb the night's rest. There is altogether no prouder and at the same time more exquisite kind of book than my books. They attain here and there the highest thing that can be attained on earth, cynicism. One needs the most delicate fingers as well as the bravest fists if one is to master them. Any infirmity of soul excludes one from them once and for all. Any dyspepsia even does so. One must have no nerves. One must have a joyful belly. Not only does the poverty, the hole and corner air of a soul exclude it from them, cowardice, uncleanliness, secret revengefulness in the entrails does so far more. A word from me drives all bad instincts into the face. I have among my acquaintances several experimental animals on whom I bring home to myself the various, very instructively various reactions to my writings. Those who want to have nothing to do with their contents, my so-called friends, for example, have become impersonal. They congratulate me on having done it again. Progress is apparent, too, in a greater cheerfulness of tone. The completely vicious spirits, the beautiful souls, the thoroughly and utterly mendacious have no idea at all what to do with these books. Consequently, they see the same as beneath them. The beautiful consistency of all beautiful souls, the horned cattle among my acquaintances, mere Germans, if I may say so, give me to understand they are not always of my opinion, though they are sometimes. I have heard this said even of Zarathustra. Any feminism in a person or in a man likewise closes the gates on me. One will never be able to enter this labyrinth of daring knowledge. One must never have spared oneself. Harshness must be among one's habits, if one is to be happy and cheerful among nothing but hard truths. When I picture a perfect reader, I always picture a monster of courage and curiosity, also something supple, cunning, cautious, a born adventurer and discoverer. 13. I know my fate. One day there will be associated with my name the recollection of something frightful, of a crisis like no other before on earth, of the profoundest collision of conscience, of a decision evoked against everything that until then had been believed in, demanded, sanctified. I'm not a man, I'm a dynamite, and with all that there is nothing in me of a founder of religion. Religions are affairs of the rabble. I have need of washing my hands after contact with religious people. I do not want believers. I think I am too malicious to believe in myself. I never speak to masses. I have a terrible fear I shall one day be pronounced holy. One will guess why I bring out this book beforehand. It is intended to prevent people from making mischief with me. I do not want to be a saint, rather even a buffoon. Perhaps I am a buffoon, and nonetheless, or rather, or not nonetheless, for there has hitherto been nothing more mendacious than saints, the truth speaks out of me. But my truth is dreadful, for hitherto the lie has been called truth, revaluation of all values. That is my formula for an act of supreme coming to oneself on the part of mankind, which in me has become flesh and genius. It is my fate to be the first decent human being, to know myself in opposition to the mendaciousness of millennia. I was the first to discover the truth, in that I was the first to sense, smell, the lie as lie. My genius is in my nostrils. I contradict as has never been contradicted, and I am nonetheless the opposite of a negative spirit. I am a bringer of good tidings, such as there has never been. I know tasks from such a height that any conception of them has hitherto been lacking. Only after me is it possible to hope again. With all that, I am necessarily a man of fatality, for when truth steps into battle with the lie of millennia, we shall have convulsions, an earthquake spasm, a transposition of valley and mountain such as has never been dreamed of. The concept politics has then become completely absorbed into a war of spirits. All the power structure of the old society have been blown into the air. They one and all reposed on the lie. There will be wars such as there have never yet been on earth. Only after me will there be grand politics on earth. Part 1. Philosophy and Philosophers. 1. Family failing of philosophers. All philosophers have the common failing of starting out from man as he is now and thinking they can reach their goal through an analysis of him. They involuntarily think of a man as an eterna veritas, as something that remains constant in the midst of all flux, as a sure measure of things. Everything the philosophers declared about man is, however, at bottom no more than a testimony as to the man of a very limited period of time. Lack of historical sense is the family failing of all philosophers. Many, without being aware of it, even take the most recent manifestations of man, such as has arisen under the impress of certain religions, even certain political events, as the fixed form from which one has to start out. They will not learn that man has become, that the faculty of cognition has become, while some of them would have it that the whole world is spun out of this faculty of cognition. Now everything essential in the development of mankind took place in primeval times, long before the 4,000 years we more or less know about. During these years mankind may well not have altered very much, but the philosopher here sees instincts in man as he now is, and assumes that these belong to the unalterable facts of mankind, and to that extent could provide a key to the understanding of the world in general. The whole of teleology is constructed by speaking of the man of the last 4 millennia as of an eternal man, towards whom all things in the world have had a natural relationship from the time he began. But everything has become. There are no eternal facts, just as there are no absolute truths. Consequently, what is needed from now on is historical philosophizing, and with it the virtue of modesty. 2. Private and public morality. Since belief has ceased that God broadly directs the destinies of the world, and that, all the apparent twists and turns in its path notwithstanding, is leading mankind gloriously upward, man has to set himself ecumenical goals, embracing the whole earth. The former morality, namely Kant's, demanded of the individual actions which one desired of all men. That was a very naive thing, as if everyone knew without further ado what mode of action would benefit the whole of mankind, that is, what actions at all are desirable. It is a theory like that of free trade, presupposing that universal harmony must result of itself in accordance with innate laws of progress. Perhaps some future survey of the requirements of mankind will show that it is absolutely not desirable that all men should act in the same way, but rather that in the interests of ecumenical goals, whole tracts of mankind ought to have special, perhaps under certain circumstances, even evil tasks imposed upon them. In any event, if mankind is not to destroy itself through such conscious universal rule, it must first of all attain to a hitherto altogether unprecedented knowledge of the preconditions of culture, as a scientific standard for ecumenical goals. Herein lies the tremendous task facing the great spirits of the coming century. 3. From the thinker's innermost experience. Nothing is more difficult for man than to apprehend a thing impersonally. I mean to see it as a thing, not as a person. One might question, indeed, whether it is at all possible for him to suspend the clockwork of his person-constructing, person-inventing drive, even for a moment. He traffics even with ideas, though they be the most abstract, as if there were individuals with whom one has to struggle, to whom one has to tend, to whom one has to ally oneself, protect and nourish. We have only to spy on ourselves at that moment when we hear or discover a proposition new to us. Perhaps it displeases us because of its defiant and autocratic bearing. We unconsciously ask ourselves whether we shall not set a counter-proposition, as an enemy beside it, whether we can append to it a perhaps, a sometimes. Even the little word probably does us good, because it breaks the personally burdensome tyranny of the unconditional. If, on the other hand, this new proposition approaches in a milder shape, nice and tolerant, humble, and sinking, as it were, into the arms of contradiction, we try another way of testing our autocracy. What? Can we not come to the assistance of this weak creature, stroke and feed it, give it strength and fullness, indeed truth, and even unconditionally? Can we possibly be parental or nicely or pitying towards it? Then again, we behold a judgment here and a judgment there, separated from one another, not regarding one another, making no impression upon the other, and we are tickled by the thought of whether here a marriage might not be arranged, a conclusion drawn, in the presentiment that, if a consequence should proceed from this conclusion, the honor of it will fall not only to the two marriage judgments, but also to those who arrange the marriage. If, however, one can get hold of that idea, neither by means of defiance and ill will, nor by means of goodwill, if one holds it for true, then one yields and pays it homage as a prince and leader, accords it a seat of honor, and speaks of it with pomp and pride, for in its glitter, one glitters too. Woe to him who seeks to darken it, unless it itself should one day become suspicious to us. Then, unwearying kingmakers in the history of the spirit that we are, we hurl it from the throne, and immediately raise its opponent in its place. Let one ponder this, and then think on a little further. Certainly, no one will then speak of a drive to knowledge in and for itself. Why then does man prefer the true to the untrue in this secret struggle with idea persons? For the same reason as he practices justice in traffic with real persons, now out of habit, heredity, and training, originally because the true, as also the fair and just, is more useful and more productive of honor than the untrue. For in the realm of thought, power and fame are hard to maintain if erected on the basis of error or lies. The feeling that such a building could at some time or other fall down is humiliating to the self-conceit of its architect. He is ashamed of the fragility of his material, and because he takes himself more seriously than he does the rest of the world, wants not to do nothing that is not more enduring than the rest of the world. It is his immeasurable pride which wants to employ only the finest, hardest stones for its work, that is to say, truths, or what it takes for truths, that we are afraid of our own ideas, concepts, words, but also honor ourselves in them, and involuntarily ascribe to them the capacity to instruct, despise, praise, and censure us, that we thus traffic with them as with three intelligent persons, with independent powers, as equals with equals, It is in this that the strange phenomenon I have called intellectual conscience has its roots. In the desert of science. To the man of science, on his unassuming and laborious travels, which must often enough be journeys through the desert, there appear those glittering mirages called philosophical systems, with bewitching, deceptive power. They show the solution of all enigmas and the freshest draught of the true water of life, to be near at hand. His heart rejoices, and it seems to be the weary traveller that his lips already touch the goal of all the perseverance and sorrows of the scientific life, so that he involuntarily presses forward. There are other natures, to be sure, which stand still, as if bewildered by the fair illusion. The desert swallows them up, and they are dead to science. Other natures, again, which have often before experienced this subjective solace, may well grow exceedingly ill-humoured, and curse the salty taste which these apparitions leave behind in the mouth, and from which arises a raging thirst, without one's having been brought so much as a single step nearer to any kind of spring. 5. Error of philosophers. The philosopher believes that the value of his philosophy lies in the whole, in the building. Posterity discovers it in the bricks with which he built, and which are then often used again for better building. In the fact, that is to say, that that building can be destroyed and nonetheless possesses value as material. 6. The tyrants of the spirit. The march of science is now no longer crossed by the accidental fact that men live for about 70 years, as was for all too long the case. Formerly, a man wanted to reach the far end of knowledge during this period of time, and the methods of acquiring knowledge were evaluated in accordance with this universal longing. The small single questions and experiments were counted contemptible. One wanted the shortest route. One believed that, because everything in the world seemed to be accommodated to man, the knowability of things was also accommodated to a human time span. To solve everything at a stroke, with a single word, that was the secret desire. There is a riddle to be solved. Thus did the goal of life appear to the eye of the philosopher. The first thing to do was to find the riddle and to compress the problem of the world into the simplest riddle form. The boundless ambition and exultation of being the unriddler of the world constituted the thinker's dreams. Nothing seemed worthwhile if it was not the means of bringing everything to a conclusion for him. Philosophy was thus a kind of supreme struggle to possess the tyrannical rule of the spirit. That some such very fortunate, subtle, inventive, bold, and mighty man was in reserve, one only, was doubted by none, and several, most recently Schopenhauer, fancied themselves to be that one. From this it follows that by and large the sciences have hitherto been kept back by the moral narrowness of their disciples, and that henceforth they must be carried on with a higher and more magnanimous basic feeling. What do I matter? Stands over the door of the thinker of the future. 7. Intellectual conscience. Again and again I am brought up against it, and again I resist it. I don't want to believe it, even though it is almost palpable. The vast majority lack an intellectual conscience. Indeed, it often seems to me that to demand such a thing is to be in the most populous cities as solitary as in the desert. Everyone looks at you strangely and goes on working his scales, calling this good, that evil. Nobody blushes for shame when you remark that the weights he is using are giving short weight. But nobody is annoyed with you either. Perhaps they laugh at your doubts. What I mean to say is, the vast majority do not find it contemptible to believe this or that, and to live in accordance with this belief without first being aware of the ultimate and securest reasons for and against it, and without afterwards even taking the trouble to discover such reasons. The most gifted men and the noblest women are still among this vast majority. But what is good-heartedness, refinement, and genius to me, if the person possessing these virtues tolerates in himself slack feelings with respect to belief and judgment, if the demand for certainty is not his innermost desire and profoundest need, as that which divides the higher men from the lower? Among certain pious people, I have lit upon a hatred of reason, and I was grateful to them for it. At least the bad intellectual conscience thus betrayed itself. But to stand in the midst of this rerum concordia discourse, and the whole marvelous uncertainty of existence, and not to question, not to tremble with the desire and joy of questioning, not even to hate him who does ask questions, perhaps even to be thoroughly entertained by him, that is what I feel to be contemptible, and it is this feeling I seek first of all in everyone I meet. Some folly or other again and again persuades me that every man possesses this feeling, as man. It is my kind of injustice. 8. Unwelcome disciples. What shall I do with these two little disciples? Ill-humouredly exclaimed a philosopher who corrupted youth as Socrates had once corrupted them. They are pupils I do not want. This one cannot say no, and the other says to everything half and half. Suppose they grasped my teaching, the former would suffer too much, for my way of thinking calls for a warlike soul, a desire to hurt, a joy in denial, a hard hide. He would sicken and die of open and inner wounds. And the other will make for himself out of every cause he espouses something mediocre, and will thus make the cause itself into something mediocre. Such a disciple I wish to my enemy. Nine. Sense for truth. Give me any kind of skeptical proposal to which I am permitted to reply, let's try it. But I want to hear nothing more of anything or question which does not admit of experimentation. This is the limit of my sense for truth, for there bravery has lost its rights. 10. Ability to contradict. Everyone now knows that the ability to endure contradiction is a high sign of culture. Some even know that the higher man wants and evokes contradiction so as to acquire a guidepost to his own acts of injustice, hitherto unknown to him. But that the ability to contradict calls for a good conscience, in enmity towards the customary, the traditional, the sanctified, that is more than the other two, and what is actually great, new, astonishing in our culture, the step of steps for the liberated spirit. Who knows that? 11. As interpreters of our experiences. One kind of honesty has been unknown to all founders of religions and their like. They have never made of their experiences a matter of conscience for knowledge. What did I really experience? What happened in me and around me then? Was my mind sufficiently alert? Was my will bent against faint fantasy? None of them has asked such questions. None of our dear religious people asks such questions, even now. They feel, rather, a thirst for things which are contrary to reason, and do not put too many difficulties in the way of satisfying it. Thus they experience miracles and rebirths, and hear the voices of angels. But we others, thirsty for reason, want to look our experiences as fixedly in the eye as a scientific experiment, hour by hour, day after day. We ourselves want to be our own experiments and vivisectional animals. 12. I name you 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. How the spirit shall become a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. There are many heavy things for the spirit, for the strong, weight-bearing spirit, in which dwell respect and awe. Its strength longs for the heaviest. What is heavy? Thus asks the weight-bearing spirit. Thus it kneels down like the camel and wants to be well laden. What is the heaviest thing, you heroes? So asks the weight-bearing spirit, that I may take it upon me and rejoice in my strength. Is it not this? To debase yourself in order to injure your pride? To let your folly shine out in order to mock your wisdom? Or is it this? To desert our cause when it is celebrating its victory? To climb high mountains in order to tempt the tempter? Or is it this? To feed upon the acorns and grass of knowledge, and for the sake of truth to suffer hunger of the soul? Or is it this? To be sick and to send away comforters and make friends with the deaf, who never hear what you ask? Or is it this? To wade into dirty water when it is the water of truth, and not to disdain cold frogs and hot toads? Or is it this? To love those who despise us and to offer our hand to the ghost when it wants to frighten us? The weight-bearing spirit takes upon itself all these heaviest things, like a camel hurrying laden into the desert. Thus it hurries into its desert. But in the loneliest desert, the second metamorphosis occurs. The spirit here becomes a lion. It wants to capture freedom and be lord in its own desert. It seeks here its ultimate lord. It will be an enemy to him and to its ultimate god, and it will struggle for victory with the great dragon. What is the great dragon which the spirit no longer wants to call Lord and God? The great dragon is called You Shall, but the spirit of the lion says I will. You Shall lies in its path, sparkling with gold, a scale-colored beast, and on every scale glitters golden You Shall. Values of 1,000 years glitter on the scales, and thus speaks the mightiest of all dragons. All the values of things glitter on me. All values have already been created, and all created values are in me. Truly, there shall be no more I will. Thus speaks the dragon. My brothers, why is the dragon lion needed in the spirit? Why does the beast of burden that renounces and is irreverent not suffice? To create new values, even the lion is incapable of that. But to create itself freedom for new creation, that the might of the lion can do. To create freedom for itself and a sacred no even to duty, the lion is needed for that, my brothers. To seize the right to new values, that is the most terrible proceeding for a weight-bearing and reverential spirit. Truly, to this spirit it is a theft and a work for an animal of prey. Once it loved this You Shall as its holiest thing. Now it has to find illusion and caprice even in the holiest, that it may steal freedom from its love. The lion is needed for this theft. But tell me, my brothers, what can the child do that even the lion cannot? Why must the praying lion still become a child? The child is innocence and forgetfulness. A new beginning, a sport, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion, a sacred yes. Yes, a sacred yes is needed, my brothers, for the sport of creation. The spirit now wills its own will. The spirit sundered from the world now wins its own world. I have named you 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. How the spirit became a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child.